The morning sun cast long shadows across the New Eden colony's residential district when the first explosions shattered the peaceful silence. Dr. Sarah was reviewing her botanical research notes in her small laboratory when the ground beneath her feet trembled violently. Coffee spilled across her desk, soaking into months of carefully documented plant specimens from the local ecosystem. Outside her window, she could see children playing in the courtyard of the elementary school across the street. Little Emma was chasing her friends around the swing set, her laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. The sight brought a smile to Sarah's face. These moments of pure joy reminded her why humanity had ventured so far from Earth to build new homes among the stars. The second explosion was closer, much closer. The laboratory's reinforced windows cracked, spiderwebbing from the impact. Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized the sound had come from the direction of the school. She pressed her face against the damaged glass, trying to see through the billowing smoke that now obscured her view. Alien ships materialized overhead like dark omens against the blue sky. They were sleek, predatory vessels that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Sarah had never seen their design before, but the intent was unmistakably hostile. Energy weapons lanced down from the ships, carving molten furrows through buildings and playground equipment alike. Sarah's hands shook as she activated her emergency communicator. The device crackled with static and overlapping voices, colonists calling for help, security forces trying to coordinate a response, parents screaming for their children. Through it all, she heard Colonel's steady voice cutting through the chaos. All civilians to emergency shelters immediately. This is not a drill. Military personnel report to defensive positions. Repeat, this is not a drill. But Sarah couldn't move. She watched in horror as the alien ships focused their fire on the school building. The structure, built to withstand the planet's occasional seismic activity, crumbled like a house of cards under the sustained barrage. Where moments before children had been playing and learning, now only flames and rubble remained. The aliens landed in the aftermath, creatures that moved with unsettling grace despite their imposing size. They stood nearly 8 feet tall, with elongated limbs that ended in razor-sharp claws. Their skin had a translucent quality, revealing the dark fluid that pulsed through their veins. Most disturbing were their faces, vaguely humanoid but lacking any trace of emotion or empathy. They were predators in the sense. Sarah finally found the strength to move when she saw them beginning to sort through the wreckage of the school, not searching for survivors to rescue, but hunting for any children who might have escaped the initial assault. Her scientific mind, their behavior, even as her heart broke, systematic, methodical, thorough. They were ensuring no human child survived. She ran through the laboratory's back exit, clutching her research data and emergency supplies. The colony's emergency bunkers were located in the Geological Survey Station on the far side of town, nearly a mile away through increasingly dangerous territory. But Sarah had to try. She had to survive to tell someone what she had witnessed. The journey became a nightmare of hiding and running. Sarah ducked behind overturned vehicles and collapsed buildings as alien patrols swept through the streets. She watched them enter homes and emerge moments later, their claws dripping with blood. No mercy was shown to anyone, men, women, elderly, children. The aliens killed with mechanical efficiency. At the family's house, Sarah witnessed something that would haunt her forever. The aliens dragged out Tom, the colony's head engineer, along with his wife and their twin daughters, barely 6 years old. The family was forced to kneel in their front yard while one of the creatures activated what appeared to be a recording device. The alien spoke in perfect, unaccented English, its voice carrying no emotion despite the perfect pronunciation. Human colony designated New Eden has been marked for elimination. Your species' expansion into this sector violates territorial agreements established by the Hegemony Council. This recording serves as documentation of compliance with Eradication Protocol 7. Tom tried to plead for his children's lives, offering himself as a willing sacrifice if only the girls could be spared. The alien listened impassively before responding with the same mechanical tone. Hegemony Protocol requires complete genetic line termination to prevent revenge-seeking behavior in surviving offspring. Your request cannot be accommodated. What followed was swift and brutal. Sarah pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle her sobs as the family was methodically executed. The recording device captured everything in clinical detail, another data point for whoever had ordered this massacre. The aliens were creating evidence. They wanted someone to know what happened here and why. This wasn't random violence or even conquest. It was a message meant for other human colonies, perhaps even Earth itself. Sarah finally reached the geological station as the sun began to set. The building appeared empty, but she knew the emergency bunkers extended deep underground. Using her security clearance, she accessed the main elevator and descended 3 levels below the surface. The bunker was designed to house nearly 200 colonists for up to 6 months, but Sarah found only 43 survivors huddled in the main chamber. Colonel was among them, his uniform torn and stained with blood that wasn't his own. His left arm hung useless at his side, clearly broken during whatever fighting he'd encountered before reaching safety. Despite his injuries, he was busy organizing the survivors into work groups and establishing communication protocols. "Doctor," he acknowledged her arrival with a nod. "What's the situation topside?" Sarah struggled to find words that could adequately describe the horror she'd witnessed. "They're not just attacking military targets, Colonel. They're specifically hunting children. The school was their first target. They're executing entire families and recording it." His jaw tightened. "Recording. I think it's meant to be evidence or documentation. One of them mentioned something called Eradication Protocol 7 and territorial agreements. This isn't random, sir. Someone ordered this specifically to send a message." The colonel absorbed this information grimly. "Our long-range communications are down. The bastards took out the satellite array before they started ground operations. We can't warn Earth or call for help." Doctor, the colony's chief medical officer, looked up from treating wounded survivors. "We've got 12 children down here, ranging from age 4 to 16. If what Doctor observed is accurate, we need to prioritize their protection above everything else." "Agreed," replied without hesitation. "These bunkers were designed to be undetectable from orbit. As long as we maintain communication silence and don't give away our position, we should be able to wait them out." But Sarah wasn't convinced waiting was enough. "Colonel, what if this isn't just about New Eden? What if they're planning to do this to every human colony in this sector? How many other worlds are out there with children just like these?" The question hung heavy in the recycled air of the bunker. Everyone understood the implication. They weren't just survivors of a massacre. They were witnesses to what might be the opening move in a war of extermination. Over the following days, they maintained radio silence while using passive sensors to monitor the aliens' activities above ground. The creatures were thorough in their work, systematically destroying every trace of human presence on the planet. They demolished buildings, incinerated crops, and even poisoned water sources. Whatever this Eradication Protocol 7 entailed, it included removing all evidence that humans had ever set foot on this world. Sarah found herself thinking about the implications during the long, dark hours. The aliens hadn't simply conquered the colony, they were erasing it. That suggested this wasn't about claiming territory for themselves, but about sending a clear message to humanity. Stay away from this region of space or face complete annihilation. On the 4th day, their passive sensors detected the alien ships departing the system. The creatures left behind no garrison, no monitoring equipment, nothing to suggest they intended to occupy the planet. They had accomplished their mission and moved on, leaving New Eden as a dead world and a warning. Colonel assembled the survivors in the bunker's main chamber. His arm was now properly set and secured in a makeshift sling, though Sarah could see the pain still etched in his features. "The alien fleet has departed the system," he announced. "Long-range scans show we're alone here, but we can't assume they won't return. We need to get word to Earth about what happened here and what we learned." "The emergency transmitter in Communications Building 7 has an independent power source," suggested Jake, one of the few surviving technicians. "If the aliens didn't specifically target it, we might be able to get a message out." Sarah volunteered to accompany the reconnaissance team, despite initial objections. As a scientist, she had observed the aliens' behavior more systematically than most survivors. Her testimony might provide crucial intelligence for Earth's military planners. The journey back to the surface revealed the true scope of the devastation. New Eden, once a thriving community of nearly 3,000 colonists, was now a wasteland of ash and twisted metal. The aliens had been remarkably thorough. Even the memorial garden where colonists had buried their loved ones had been systematically destroyed. Communications Building 7 still stood, though its exterior was by weapons fire. The emergency transmitter was intact, its quantum encryption system still functional. Jake worked feverishly to establish a connection while Sarah and the security team maintained watch for any returning alien patrols. "Got it," Jake announced after nearly an hour of work. "Quantum entanglement link is stable. We're connected to the Terran Defense Network relay station on base." Colonel took the communication headset, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he needed to report. "This is Colonel, commanding officer of New Eden Colony in the 442 system. We are transmitting under Emergency Protocol Alpha 7. New Eden has been attacked and effectively destroyed by unknown alien forces. Estimated casualties: 2,957 colonists, including 432 children." The response from base was immediate, crackling with disbelief and urgency. "Colonel, this is Admiral Harrison. Confirm your last transmission. Did you say nearly 3,000 casualties?" "Confirmed, Admiral. The attack was systematic and targeted specifically at civilians, with particular focus on eliminating children. The aliens documented their actions and referenced something called Eradication Protocol 7. We have 43 survivors currently taking shelter in emergency bunkers." There was a long pause before Admiral Harrison's voice returned, laden with grim understanding. "Colonel, we've received similar reports from 3 other colonies in your sector within the past week. Harvest Station, Meridian Point, and New Geneva have all gone dark. We're dispatching the 7th Fleet to investigate, but they won't reach your position for at least 6 weeks." Sarah stepped forward, requesting the communication headset. "Admiral, this is Dr. Sarah, attached to the New Eden Research Station. Based on my observations, I believe these attacks are part of a coordinated campaign designed to establish territorial boundaries. The aliens aren't trying to conquer human space. They're trying to contain it by making expansion too costly to sustain." "Explain, Doctor." "They specifically targeted children, Admiral. In evolutionary terms, offspring represent the future of a species. By systematically eliminating human children in border territories, they're sending a message that any attempt to expand into their claimed space will result in genetic extinction, not just military defeat. It's psychological warfare at the species level." Admiral Harrison's response carried the weight of someone who understood the broader implications. "Doctor, are you suggesting these attacks will continue if we don't withdraw from the outer colonies?" "I'm suggesting they'll escalate, Admiral. If humanity doesn't respond decisively to this message, the aliens will likely interpret it as weakness and push deeper into established human space. They're testing our resolve." The communication link crackled with static as Admiral Harrison conferred with unseen advisors. When his voice returned, it carried a new edge of determination. "Colonel Doctor, your testimony is being forwarded directly to Earth Command and the Colonial Assembly. Stand by for evacuation within 6 weeks. And Colonel." "Yes, Admiral." "Document everything. Record every detail about their tactics, their technology, their apparent motivations. If this is the beginning of a larger conflict, your intelligence may be crucial in determining humanity's response." Sarah looked out through the damaged window of the communications building, across the ruins of what had been a thriving human community just days before. Somewhere in the ashes lay the bodies of Emma and hundreds of other children whose only crime had been existing in space that aliens claimed as their own. But as she watched the other survivors working to establish temporary shelter and organize their resources, Sarah realized something important. The aliens had made a fundamental miscalculation in their psychological warfare. They assumed that witnessing the systematic murder of children would break human resolve and force a withdrawal from contested territory. Instead, they had just shown 43 survivors, and soon all of humanity, exactly what they were capable of. And in doing so, they had awakened something in the human spirit that had powered the species through every existential threat it had ever faced. The aliens wanted to send a message about the cost of expansion into their territory. They had succeeded, but perhaps not in the way they intended. The message humanity received was clear. These creatures viewed human children as acceptable targets in their territorial disputes. That was a mistake they would come to regret. As night fell over the ruins of New Eden, Sarah began composing her detailed report for Earth Command. Every observation, every tactical detail, Every insight into alien psychology would be meticulously documented, because she understood something the aliens apparently didn't. Humanity's greatest strength had never been its technology or military might. It was what people were willing to do to protect their children. And these aliens had just declared war on every human child in the galaxy. The emergency session of the Terran Colonial Assembly convened in Geneva exactly 72 hours after the first reports from the outer colonies reached Earth. Representatives from every human world packed the Great Hall, their faces grim with the knowledge of what they were about to discuss. Above them, massive holographic displays showed the latest intelligence reports. 4 colonies destroyed, over 12,000 civilians dead, and an estimated 800 children murdered in systematic executions. President stood at the central podium, her usually composed demeanor cracked by the weight of the crisis. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that she shared a surname with one of the documented victims from New Eden. Though Tom and his family were distant relatives at best, the psychological impact was profound. "Ladies and," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, "we are here to address the most serious threat to human civilization since the resource wars of the 22nd century. The attacks on our outer colonies represent not just an act of aggression, but a deliberate attempt to terrorize our entire species through the systematic murder of our children." Admiral Sarah Harrison, recently promoted to Chief of Colonial Defense, activated the holographic display showing tactical recordings from the attacks. The footage was grainy and incomplete, cobbled together from security cameras and survivor testimonies, but it painted a clear picture of calculated brutality. "The enemy forces demonstrate superior technology in several key areas," Admiral Harrison reported with clinical precision. "Their ships appear to use some form of shielding that makes them nearly invisible to our standard detection systems until they're practically on top of their targets. Their energy weapons are approximately 40% more efficient than our current plasma arrays, and their ground forces show enhanced physical capabilities compared to baseline human parameters." Dr. Elizabeth, Sarah's sister who had escaped New Eden, appeared via quantum link from the base medical facility where she was being debriefed. Her pale, drawn features showed the strain of recent trauma, but her voice remained steady as she delivered her report. "The psychological profile of the attacking species suggests they operate under a rigid hierarchical system with predetermined protocols for territorial disputes," Elizabeth explained. "What we witnessed wasn't random violence. It was the execution of a specific military doctrine designed to achieve psychological objectives rather than traditional conquest." Representative James Walker from the Mars Colonial Authority leaned forward in his seat. "Doctor, are you saying these attacks were designed to terrorize rather than conquer?" "Precisely. Traditional conquest would involve occupying territory, exploiting resources, or enslaving populations. These aliens did none of that. They killed everyone they could find, recorded evidence of the killings, and then departed without leaving any occupying force. The objective was clearly to send a message rather than gain territory." The murmur that rippled through the assembly carried undertones of anger and disbelief. These weren't the actions of a conventional military force seeking to expand its territory. They were the calculated moves of an enemy that viewed psychological warfare as more effective than traditional combat. General, Earth's top military strategist, stood to address the assembly. His weathered face bore the scars of campaigns on 3 different worlds, and his reputation for tactical brilliance was legendary throughout human space. "Based on the intelligence gathered from the survivor testimonies, we're dealing with an enemy that fundamentally misunderstands human psychology," began. "Their approach assumes that demonstrating superior firepower and willingness to target civilians will force us to withdraw from disputed territories. This suggests they've successfully used similar tactics against other species." President nodded grimly. "General, what's your assessment of their strategic objectives?" "They want to establish a buffer zone between their territory and ours without having to commit resources to long-term occupation. By making expansion too costly, not in terms of military losses, but in terms of civilian casualties, they hope to contain human space within acceptable boundaries." Doctor's voice crackled through the quantum link. "There's another aspect we need to consider. The systematic targeting of children suggests they understand the importance of offspring to human psychology, but they may have overestimated how we'll respond to that threat. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Representative Walker voiced what everyone was thinking. They expected us to retreat to protect our remaining children. Instead, they've just shown every parent in human space exactly what will happen if we don't stop them, General finished grimly. Admiral Harrison brought up new tactical displays showing human fleet dispositions across known space. We have 17 full battle groups currently deployed across our colonial territories, with another 12 in various stages of readiness at Earth and the core worlds. However, based on the technological advantages demonstrated by the enemy forces, a direct military confrontation would likely result in significant casualties. President studied the displays carefully. Admiral, what are our options for evacuation of the remaining outer colonies? We could pull back approximately 50,000 colonists from the most exposed settlements within 3 months, but that would mean abandoning nearly 200 worlds that represent 40 years of human expansion. The economic and psychological impact would be devastating. Representative Walker stood up, his face flushed with anger. With respect, Madam President, we're talking about surrendering nearly half of human space to an enemy that murders children as a matter of policy. How do we explain that to the families of the victims? We don't, came a new voice from the back of the chamber. Everyone turned to see Fleet Admiral Wei, the legendary hero of the campaign, walking slowly toward the central floor. His advanced age required him to use a walking stick, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. Admiral, President acknowledged respectfully, we weren't expecting you to attend this session. The old Admiral's eyes were hard as steel. When someone declares war on human children, Madam President, every person who has ever worn a uniform has a duty to respond. I've read the reports from New Eden and the other colonies. I've studied the tactical recordings and survivor testimonies, and I've reached a conclusion that I believe this assembly needs to hear. The chamber fell completely silent as Admiral made his way to the speaker's podium. His reputation preceded him. This was the man who had led humanity's first successful interstellar military campaign, the architect of colonial defense doctrine, and widely regarded as the finest strategic mind of his generation. These aliens have made a fundamental error in their understanding of human nature, Admiral began, his voice carrying clearly despite his age. They believe that by demonstrating their willingness to target our children, they can force us to abandon our territorial expansion. They've studied our expansion patterns, our settlement priorities, our resource allocation, but they failed to study our history. Dr. Elizabeth watched from the medical facility as her grandfather's namesake, no relation, but sharing the family dedication to service, outlined what would become known as the doctrine. Throughout human history, there has been one consistent pattern in how our species responds to existential threats. When faced with enemies who threaten our children, we don't retreat, we adapt. We innovate. We become something our enemies never expected us to become. General leaned forward, understanding where this was leading. Admiral, are you suggesting we escalate rather than evacuate? I'm suggesting we show these aliens the same thing we showed the rebels 40 years ago. When you threaten human children, you don't get a limited war with negotiated settlements. You get total war with unconditional surrender. The words hung in the air like a challenge. President felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. The decision she made in the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of human expansion, but the very nature of humanity's place in the galaxy. Admiral, what exactly are you proposing? The old Admiral's smile was cold and predatory. I'm proposing we give these aliens exactly what they asked for. They want to see what happens when someone threatens human children. Let's show them. He activated a holographic display showing fleet deployment schedules and resource allocation charts. We have 6 months before they expect a response to their ultimatum. 6 months to mobilize every ship, every weapon, every technological advantage we can develop. But more importantly, we have 6 months to show them that they fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with. Doctor's voice came through the quantum link with new determination. Admiral, the psychological profiles I've developed suggest these aliens operate under rigid protocols. They're not accustomed to enemies that adapt and escalate beyond their planned parameters. Exactly, Doctor. They plan for us to retreat or to meet them with conventional military responses. They didn't plan for us to become something else entirely. Representative Walker raised his hand. Admiral, what do you mean by something else entirely? Admiral's expression grew even more serious. I mean, we stop fighting like a colonial defense force trying to protect territory. We start fighting like an entire species that's been threatened with extinction, because that's exactly what this is. General stood up, his tactical mind already working through the implications. You're talking about total mobilization. Every resource, every ship, every available person dedicated to a single objective. The objective being making sure these aliens never threaten a human child again, ever. The chamber erupted in discussion as representatives grasped the magnitude of what was being proposed. This wasn't just a military response. It was a fundamental shift in how humanity would operate in the galaxy. President called for order, her voice cutting through the chaos. Admirals, spell out exactly what you're proposing. Phase 1, complete evacuation of all civilians from the outer colonies, but we leave behind automated monitoring systems and military volunteers. When the aliens return to verify their ultimatum was effective, they'll find empty colonies, but they'll also trigger our observation networks. Phase 2, we use the intelligence gathered from Phase 1 to develop countermeasures for their technology. Every advantage they demonstrated gets neutralized or turned against them. Phase 3, we don't just defend our territory, we take the fight to them. Every world they consider theirs becomes a potential target. Every ship they field becomes a priority for destruction. Doctor's voice carried a note of concern. Admiral, that's essentially declaring a war of extermination against an entire species. Doctor, they declared a war of extermination against us the moment they decided our children were acceptable casualties. The only question now is whether we're going to fight that war on their terms or ours. The silence that followed was profound. Every person in the chamber understood they were at a crossroads in human history. The decision they made would echo across generations and determine what kind of species humanity would become among the stars. President looked around the chamber, gauging the mood of the representatives. What she saw surprised her, not fear or hesitation, but a growing resolve that seemed to strengthen with each passing moment. All in favor of authorizing Admiral to develop detailed plans for what he's outlined. Hands rose throughout the chamber, not gradually, but all at once in a wave of unified determination. The vote was unanimous. Admiral nodded grimly. Ladies, I'll need 6 months to prepare for this campaign, but I want to be absolutely clear about what we're undertaking. When we're finished, these aliens will either surrender unconditionally or cease to exist as a spacefaring civilization. There will be no middle ground. Because they made it a war about children, General added quietly. Because they made it a war about children, Admiral confirmed. Doctor watched from her medical facility as her grandfather's portrait, displayed in the assembly chamber among other heroes of human expansion, seemed to look down approvingly at his namesake's declaration. She thought about the family, about little Emma, about all the children whose murders had brought humanity to this moment. The aliens had wanted to send a message about the cost of expansion into their territory. The message humanity was about to send back would be far more definitive. Threatening human children wasn't just a tactical error, it was a species-ending mistake. As the assembly session concluded and representatives began coordinating the massive mobilization effort that would follow, Doctor composed a final addition to her report. The aliens had demonstrated superior technology and ruthless efficiency in their attacks on human colonies. But they had also revealed something else, a fundamental misunderstanding of what they were really fighting. They thought they were fighting a territorial dispute with an expanding species. They were actually fighting for survival against an entire civilization that had just been shown exactly why it needed to become something more dangerous than they ever imagined. The war for human expansion was over. The war for species survival was about to begin. 6 months after the Geneva Assembly, the industrial capacity of human space had been transformed into something the galaxy had never seen before. Dr. Elizabeth stood in the observation deck of the massive shipyard orbiting Jupiter, watching the final assembly of what Admiral had designated the Retribution Fleet. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Nearly 400 warships of entirely new design, each one incorporating technological advances that had taken humanity only months to develop when properly motivated. The motivation was simple and absolute: ensure that no alien species would ever consider human children acceptable targets again. Dr. Admiral is requesting your presence in the Tactical Planning Center, announced Lieutenant Commander Jessica Park, one of the thousands of officers who had volunteered for what everyone understood was likely a one-way mission. Elizabeth nodded and made her way through the station's corridors, noting how every surface displayed memorial images of the children killed in the initial attacks. The psychological impact was deliberate. Every person involved in the operation needed to remember exactly why they were about to undertake the most ambitious military campaign in human history. The tactical center buzzed with activity as hundreds of specialists coordinated the final preparations. Admiral's younger sister, who had requested transfer from diplomatic service to military command, stood before a massive holographic display showing the suspected location of the alien. Doctor, your psychological analysis suggests we can expect the enemy to respond predictably to our initial probe, Admiral said without preamble. Walk me through your reasoning again. Elizabeth activated her own display, showing behavioral patterns derived from the recorded attacks on the colonies. The species we're dealing with operates under rigid hierarchical protocols. When they initiated Eradication Protocol 7, they expected one of three responses from humanity: complete withdrawal from the disputed territories, negotiated surrender with territorial concessions, or conventional military retaliation that they could defeat through superior technology. They didn't plan for us to spend 6 months completely revolutionizing our military doctrine and technology base, added Dr. James Wright, the chief of weapons development who had overseen the creation of humanity's new arsenal. The weapons themselves represented a fundamental shift in human military thinking. Instead of trying to match the aliens' superior energy weapons, human engineers had focused on developing technologies that played to humanity's strengths: adaptability, innovation, and what psychologists were calling motivated vindictiveness. The torpedoes will neutralize their main tactical advantage, Dr. Wright continued, highlighting technical specifications. Their ships use gravitational shielding to deflect energy weapons, but our torpedoes actually use that shielding as a guidance system. The stronger their defenses, the more accurate our targeting becomes. Admiral studied the technical readouts with satisfaction, and the psychological warfare component. Elizabeth's expression grew grim. Based on their rigid protocol structure, they won't be prepared for asymmetric psychological tactics. They expect either submission or conventional military resistance. They're not prepared for an enemy that specifically targets their reproduction centers and documents those attacks for broadcast to their entire species. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Humanity was preparing to use the aliens' own tactics against them, but with technological and psychological innovations they couldn't have anticipated. Admiral, incoming priority transmission from Fleet Admiral, announced the communications officer. Admiral's weathered face appeared on the central display, transmitting from the flagship Nemesis at the edge of the solar system. Admiral, Doctor, we've received confirmation from our deep reconnaissance drones. The alien has been located and their defensive installations mapped. They're exactly where our projections indicated they would be. Elizabeth leaned forward. Admiral, are the psychological profile predictions holding true? Perfectly, Doctor. They've reinforced their and core systems, but they haven't expanded their territorial patrols or altered their standard operational procedures. They're still operating under the assumption that they're dealing with a conventional territorial dispute. The strategic implications were significant. The aliens had prepared for humanity to either retreat or launch a direct assault on their forward bases. They hadn't prepared for humanity to bypass their entire defensive network and strike directly at their core systems. Phase 1 commences in 18 hours, Admiral continued. All personnel should be aware that once we initiate contact, there's no turning back. This ends with either their unconditional surrender or their complete elimination as a spacefaring threat. After the transmission ended, Admiral gathered her senior staff around the tactical display. Ladies, I want to be absolutely clear about what we're undertaking. In 18 hours, humanity is going to announce its presence to the galaxy in a way that will fundamentally change how every species views us. Dr. Wright pulled up recordings from the alien attacks on the colonies. They wanted to demonstrate that human children were acceptable casualties in territorial disputes. We're about to demonstrate that threatening human children makes your entire civilization an acceptable casualty. Elizabeth felt a chill as she contemplated the magnitude of what they were about to do. The plan that Admiral had developed over the past 6 months was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Humanity wouldn't just defeat these aliens, they would make an example of them that would echo across the galaxy for generations. Doctor, final question before we commit to this course of action, Admiral said quietly. Are you confident in your assessment that this species represents a continuing threat to human expansion? Elizabeth thought about the systematic nature of the attacks, the deliberate targeting of children, the recorded evidence meant to terrorize other human colonies. Admiral, based on their behavioral patterns and social structure, this species will view any outcome short of human retreat from the outer colonies as a failure of their deterrent strategy. If we simply defend our territory successfully, they'll escalate to more extreme measures. The only way to ensure long-term security for human children is to remove their capability to threaten anyone. Understood, all stations prepare for Phase 1 initiation. 18 hours later, the first human ships to enter alien space in over 40 years crossed the boundary into what the aliens considered their inviolate territory. But these weren't the colonial survey vessels or trading ships that had occasionally ventured into disputed regions. These were warships designed with a single purpose, demonstrating that humanity's response to murdered children was swift, merciless, and absolute. The initial contact occurred near a minor alien outpost in what their navigation charts designated as the 438 system. 3 alien patrol vessels, identical to those that had attacked the human colonies, detected the approaching human fleet and immediately activated their communication arrays to issue territorial warnings. Admiral's response was transmitted on all frequencies, both to the patrol vessels and to every monitoring station in the alien communication network. His voice was calm, professional, and completely devoid of the diplomatic niceties that had characterized previous human-alien contacts. Attention hostile forces. You are being contacted by Fleet Admiral Wei of the Terran Defense Force. Your species has committed acts of genocide against human civilian populations, including the systematic murder of children. You have 48 hours to surrender all individuals responsible for planning and executing these attacks, along with comprehensive intelligence regarding your military capabilities and territorial claims. The alien response came within minutes, transmitted in the same emotionless tone they had used when documenting their massacres of human children. Human fleet designation unknown has entered restricted territorial space. Withdraw immediately or face implementation of Eradication Protocol 7. Admiral's smile was visible to his bridge crew, though his voice remained perfectly controlled. Your response has been recorded and forwarded to Earth Command. Eradication Protocol 7 has been reviewed and rejected. Implementation of Human Response Protocol 1 begins immediately. What followed was a demonstration of how much human military technology had advanced in 6 months of focused development. The alien patrol vessels, which had easily overwhelmed colonial defense forces, found themselves completely outmatched by ships designed specifically to counter their advantages. The torpedoes locked onto their targets despite the aliens' gravitational shielding, actually using that shielding to enhance their accuracy. The new human energy weapons operated on frequencies that passed through alien defenses like they weren't there. Most importantly, the human ships demonstrated tactical coordination that the rigid alien hierarchy simply couldn't match. Within 30 minutes, all 3 alien patrol vessels had been disabled and boarded. The crews were taken prisoner, along with complete technical specifications for their equipment and communication logs that revealed the locations of major alien installations. But the real psychological impact came from what Admiral did next. Attention all alien monitoring stations, he broadcast throughout their communication network. The 3 vessels that threatened to implement Eradication Protocol 7 against human forces have been captured intact. Their crews are being transported to the Human, where they will stand trial for genocide and war crimes. They will be afforded legal representation and due process, courtesies your species to human children. The message continued with clinical precision. Analysis of captured equipment and intelligence indicates your species operates from 17 major installations and 43 minor outposts within claimed territorial space. These installations will be neutralized in order of their strategic importance. Civilian evacuations will be permitted for installations that surrender without resistance. Doctor monitored the alien communications from her position aboard the flagship, tracking their response to humanity's ultimatum. The psychological profiles she had developed proved remarkably accurate. The aliens were struggling to process a response that fell outside their predetermined protocols. "Admiral, they're requesting clarification on terms for civilian evacuations," she reported. "Their communication patterns suggest genuine confusion about the concept." "Elaborate, Doctor." "Their species apparently doesn't distinguish between military and civilian populations the way humans do. The idea that we would spare non-combatants doesn't fit their understanding of warfare." Admiral considered this information carefully. "Respond that any installation housing non-military personnel will be given additional time to evacuate those individuals before tactical operations commence. Make it clear that we define non-military as anyone not directly involved in military operations or governance." The alien response revealed something profound about their psychology. They couldn't understand why humanity would offer mercy to enemies who had shown none to human children. From their perspective, the logical response to successful aggression was either submission or escalated aggression, not a measured response that included provisions for civilian safety. Doctor realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic politics. Humanity was introducing a new paradigm for conflict, one that combined overwhelming military capability with ethical constraints that their enemies couldn't comprehend. "They're requesting direct communication with Earth Command," she reported. "I think they want to negotiate." Admiral's voice came through from the Jupiter shipyard. "Admiral, Earth Command's response is as follows. There are no negotiations. There are surrender and war crimes trials for those responsible, or there is complete military defeat. The choice is theirs." The alien communication networks fell silent for nearly 6 hours. During that time, human reconnaissance drones mapped their entire territorial space and identified key installations. The aliens had impressive technology and significant military assets, but they had never faced an enemy that could match their capabilities while operating under fundamentally different strategic assumptions. When they finally responded, the message was directed to Admiral personally and transmitted with encryption protocols that suggested it came from their highest levels of government. "Human Fleet Admiral Wei, this communication originates from the primary council of the hegemony. Your species' response to territorial correction exceeds established parameters for conflict resolution. Request clarification of human territorial objectives and acceptable terms for conflict termination." Admiral's response was broadcast throughout human space as well as to the alien networks. Every human colonist, every survivor of the attacks, every parent who had lost children, everyone heard his words. "Primary Council of the Hegemony, your species initiated genocide against human civilian populations as a method of territorial intimidation. Your objective was to demonstrate that human expansion into disputed space would result in the systematic murder of our children. Your objective has been achieved. Humanity now fully understands your methodology and intentions. However, your species failed to consider that demonstrating willingness to murder human children would result in you becoming an unacceptable threat to every human child in the galaxy. Our territorial objective is simple: ensuring you never have the capability to threaten human children again." The silence that followed lasted 3 days. During that time, human forces positioned themselves around every major alien installation while maintaining their offer of civilian evacuations. The psychological pressure on the alien leadership was immense. They faced an enemy whose response to their aggression was methodical, overwhelming, and completely outside their experience. Doctor analyzed their communication patterns and reported a fascinating development. "Admiral, their internal communications show increasing disagreement about how to respond. Their rigid hierarchy is fracturing under pressure from a situation their protocols never anticipated." "What kind of disagreement?" "Some factions want to escalate with more aggressive attacks on human civilian targets. Others are advocating for immediate surrender. The primary concern seems to be that they can't predict what humanity will do next. Admiral smiled grimly. Good. Uncertainty is what we want them to feel. For 6 months, they've known exactly how this conflict would unfold because they were controlling the parameters. Now they're fighting on our terms. The breakthrough came when a faction within the alien government initiated direct contact with human forces, bypassing their official channels. The communication was transmitted using codes that identified the senders as military commanders rather than political leaders. Human Command Authority. This communication originates from Fleet Commander of the 3rd Strike Wing. Elements within our command structure wish to discuss terms for selective cooperation in exchange for personal immunity from war crimes prosecution. Doctor's analysis was immediate. Admiral, this is exactly what the psychological profiles predicted. Their rigid hierarchy makes them vulnerable to factional splits when faced with unprecedented situations. Admiral joined the communication link from Jupiter. Admiral, Earth Command authorizes you to negotiate with any faction willing to provide intelligence and assistance in locating those responsible for the attacks on human colonies. What followed was the beginning of the end for the alien civilization, as humanity had known it. Fleet Commander represented a significant portion of the alien military that had opposed the attacks on human children from the beginning, not for moral reasons, but because they had correctly predicted that such tactics would provoke an uncontainable response from humanity. The intelligence they provided was comprehensive. Complete identification of political leaders who had authorized the attacks, detailed specifications for alien military technology, and most importantly, locations where human prisoners might still be held alive. Because there was something the aliens hadn't mentioned in their broadcast documentations of the colony attacks, they had taken prisoners. Nearly 200 human children had been captured alive and transported to research facilities for study. The aliens wanted to understand human psychological responses to trauma and separation, apparently as preparation for future psychological warfare campaigns. When Admiral learned about the prisoners, his response was immediate and uncompromising. All negotiations are suspended until every human prisoner is released unharmed. Any facility housing human prisoners that attempts to relocate or harm those individuals will be targeted for immediate destruction, regardless of civilian casualties. Doctor watched the alien communications networks explode with activity as word of the ultimatum spread. The psychological impact was exactly what she had predicted. The aliens had assumed the prisoners were a strategic asset they could use for negotiating leverage. They hadn't anticipated that threatening harm to captured human children would result in humanity abandoning all concern for collateral damage. Admiral, she reported with satisfaction, they're capitulating. Complete surrender of all facilities housing human prisoners within 12 hours. Admiral's response was transmitted to every human ship and every alien monitoring station. Acknowledged. Human medical teams will accompany retrieval operations. Any evidence of mistreatment of prisoners will result in immediate termination of all surrender negotiations. As the first human children were rescued from alien research facilities, the psychological transformation of human military doctrine became complete. What had begun as a territorial dispute had evolved into something far more fundamental, a redefinition of how humanity would interact with any species that threatened its children. The aliens had wanted to teach humanity about the costs of expansion into contested territory. Instead, they had taught humanity exactly why it needed to become something far more dangerous than any species in the galaxy had ever imagined. The rescue of the human children from alien research facilities revealed horrors that even Dr. Elizabeth's worst psychological projections hadn't anticipated. Aboard the medical ship Hippocrates, she watched as teams of specialists worked frantically to treat children who had been subjected to months of systematic psychological torture, designed to break their will and study their responses to trauma. 8-year-old, no relation to the colonel, but sharing his determination, clutched a stuffed animal that had somehow survived the capture of his colony. His physical injuries were healing, but the psychological scars ran deeper. The aliens had deliberately separated children from their families to study how human bonding affected resistance to interrogation. Doctor, called Dr. Sarah Martinez, the chief medical officer overseeing the children's treatment. We need your psychological assessment on the documentation we recovered from the research facility. The alien research notes were comprehensive and chilling. They had studied every aspect of human child psychology, from responses to separation anxiety to the breaking points for different age groups. But what made Elizabeth's blood run cold was the strategic purpose behind the research. The aliens were developing protocols for more effective psychological warfare against human colonies. They were planning to scale up, she reported to Admiral via Quantum Link. The attacks on the outer colonies weren't just territorial enforcement. They were field tests for psychological warfare techniques they intended to use against the core human worlds. Admiral's response was immediate and grim. "Doctor, are you saying they were planning to attack Earth?" Elizabeth studied the research data more carefully, cross-referencing it with the intelligence provided by Fleet Commander. "Not attack directly, Admiral. Something worse. They were planning to capture children from multiple colonies and broadcast their torture to Earth in real time. The objective was to break human civilization's will to resist by demonstrating that expansion into space would result in the systematic torture of our children." The implications were staggering. The alien leadership hadn't just ordered the murder of children in the outer colonies. They had been planning a campaign of psychological terrorism that would have targeted every human parent in the galaxy. "Admiral, there's more," Elizabeth continued, her voice tight with controlled rage. "The research notes indicate they've used similar tactics successfully against 7 other species. They have detailed protocols for psychological warfare that have resulted in the complete withdrawal of other civilizations from contested territories." Admiral's voice joined the communication link from the Jupiter shipyard. "Doctor, are you saying these aliens have systematically terrorized multiple species using attacks on their children?" "I'm saying they've perfected it, Admiral. They have refined protocols for identifying the psychological breaking points of different species and exploiting those vulnerabilities through targeted violence against offspring. They view it as more efficient than conventional warfare because it achieves territorial objectives without depleting military resources." The silence that followed was profound. Everyone involved in the operation understood they were dealing with something far more dangerous than territorial expansion. They were confronting a species that had made the psychological torture of children their primary military strategy. Admiral's voice, when it returned, carried a new edge of absolute determination. "Doctor, transmit all research data to Earth Command immediately. I'm escalating this to Human Response Protocol 2. Elizabeth felt a chill. Protocol 2 had been discussed during the planning sessions, but everyone hoped it would never be necessary. It represented a level of response that would fundamentally change humanity's relationship with every species in the galaxy. "Admiral, are you certain? Protocol 2 is irreversible." "Doctor, they've systematically tortured children from 8 different species as a matter of military policy. They have research facilities dedicated to perfecting psychological warfare against children. They were planning to broadcast the torture of human children to break our civilization's will to resist." Admiral's voice carried the weight of absolute moral certainty. "They're not just an enemy, Doctor. They're a threat to every intelligent species that values the welfare of their offspring. Protocol 2 is not just justified, it's a moral imperative." Human Response Protocol 2 was simple in concept and terrifying in implementation. Instead of limiting operations to neutralizing the immediate threat to human space, humanity would systematically dismantle the aliens' entire civilization to ensure they could never threaten anyone's children again. No prisoners except those needed for intelligence. No territorial concessions. No negotiated settlements. Complete elimination of their capacity for interstellar travel and advanced technology. Within hours of the protocol authorization, the nature of human operations in alien space changed dramatically. Ships that had been positioning for strategic strikes began systematic destruction of every piece of alien technology more advanced than basic agriculture. Research facilities, shipyards, communication arrays, orbital installations, everything that enabled the aliens to operate as a spacefaring civilization was marked for destruction. Fleet Commander, monitoring human communications from the facility where he was providing intelligence, requested an emergency meeting with Admiral. His species translator technology rendered his words with mechanical precision, but the urgency was unmistakable. "Human Admiral Way, the The scale of destruction being implemented exceeds all parameters for territorial conflict resolution. Many installations being targeted house civilian populations, with no involvement in military operations or policy decisions. Admiral's response was transmitted throughout alien space, ensuring every surviving leader heard his words. Fleet Commander, your species has research facilities dedicated to perfecting psychological warfare against children. You have systematic protocols for terrorizing multiple species through targeted violence against their offspring. You are planning to broadcast torture of human children to break our civilization. These are not the actions of military personnel following territorial policy. These are the actions of a civilization that has chosen to make the torture of children its primary strategic doctrine. Such a civilization cannot be allowed to continue existing with the capability to threaten anyone's children. Doctor monitored the alien communication networks as word of humanity's escalation spread throughout their territory. The psychological impact was devastating to their rigid social structure. They had protocols for conventional warfare, territorial negotiations, even species extinction. But they had no framework for an enemy that specifically targeted their civilization's technological capacity while sparing individual lives. Admiral, they're offering complete surrender, she reported. Full territorial concessions, reparations, whatever humanity demands. What about the research data on other species they've terrorized? Elizabeth checked the incoming communications. They're offering complete intelligence on all previous psychological warfare campaigns, including the locations of any surviving victims from other species. Admiral considered the offer carefully. Doctor, professional assessment. If we accept their surrender and allow them to retain spacefaring capability, what's the likelihood they'll resume their psychological warfare tactics against other species? Elizabeth had been preparing for this question since she first read the alien research data. Admiral, their entire military doctrine is based on psychological warfare against children. Their social structure considers it the most efficient method of territorial expansion. Even if they agreed to avoid human space, they would inevitably resume using these tactics against other species. And your assessment of whether any other species has the capability to stop them. Elizabeth thought about the research notes documenting 7 previous successful campaigns against other civilizations. Based on their records, Admiral, no species they've encountered has ever responded with anything approaching our level of escalation. They've successfully terrorized every previous opponent into complete withdrawal from contested territories. Admiral joined the communication link. Admiral, Earth Command is requesting confirmation of operational objectives under Protocol 2. Are we seeking to neutralize their threat to human space, or are we seeking to neutralize their threat to any space? The question hung in the space between them like a moral crossroads. Admiral looked out at the alien displayed on his tactical screens, a world that housed billions of individuals who had never personally harmed a human child, but belonged to a civilization that considered such harm an acceptable military strategy. Admiral Doctor, I've read the research data on their previous campaigns. 7 species terrorized into abandoning their expansion into space. Thousands of children from multiple civilizations tortured and murdered to perfect psychological warfare techniques. Research facilities dedicated to developing more effective methods of breaking different species through targeted violence against their offspring. Admiral's voice grew quieter, but his resolve strengthened. This isn't about human space anymore. This is about ensuring that no species anywhere in the galaxy ever has to face what we've faced, what those 7 other civilizations faced. Doctor understood the magnitude of what he was proposing. Admiral, you're talking about taking responsibility for galaxy-wide security against psychological warfare tactics. I'm talking about making sure that when other species encounter humanity in the future, they know we're the civilization that ended the species that tortured children as military policy. The reputation alone will prevent more conflicts than a dozen battle fleets. The decision that followed would echo across galactic history for. Admiral transmitted new operational parameters to all human forces in alien space. Complete dismantling of technological infrastructure, preservation of individual lives wherever possible, but elimination of their capacity to threaten any spacefaring civilization ever again. The aliens' orbital shipyards were the first to be destroyed, followed by their deep space communication arrays and interstellar navigation networks. Human forces moved with surgical precision, targeting every installation that enabled space travel while establishing refugee camps for displaced civilian populations. Fleet Commander watched the systematic destruction of his civilization's technological base with something approaching awe. Human Admiral, your species' response exceeds all parameters for proportional retaliation. The scale of resources committed to this operation suggests objectives beyond territorial security. Admiral's response was broadcast throughout the galaxy, transmitted on frequencies that every spacefaring civilization would detect. Fleet Commander, your species chose to make the torture of children their primary military strategy. Your research indicates you've successfully used these tactics against 7 other civilizations, forcing them to abandon their expansion into space through psychological terrorism. Humanity's objective is ensuring this never happens to anyone again. When this operation is complete, your species will retain the capacity for planetary civilization, but will never again possess the technology to threaten other species' children. More importantly, every civilization in the galaxy will understand that threatening children results in swift, total, and irreversible consequences. The message was received by monitoring stations belonging to dozens of species throughout the local galactic region. Within days, humanity began receiving communications from civilizations that had been terrorized by the aliens generations ago, offering intelligence and support for the operation. Doctor compiled the psychological profiles of 6 different species that had abandoned space exploration after encountering alien psychological warfare tactics. Each one had faced the same systematic targeting of their offspring, the same calculated torture designed to break their will to expand into space. Admiral, we're not just dealing with the threat to humanity, she reported. We're dealing with a species that has systematically stunted the development of multiple civilizations through psychological terrorism. The galactic implications are staggering. Admiral transmitted from Earth with updated authorization from the Colonial Assembly. Admiral, Earth Command has voted unanimously to expand Protocol 2 objectives. You are authorized to coordinate with any species willing to participate in ensuring this threat is permanently eliminated. What followed was unprecedented in galactic history. A coalition of multiple species united not by territorial disputes or resource competition, but by shared outrage at a civilization that had made the torture of children their primary military doctrine. 7 different species that had been terrorized into abandoning space exploration returned to provide intelligence and support for the operation. The psychological impact on the alien civilization was complete and irreversible. They had spent centuries perfecting techniques for breaking other species' will to resist through psychological warfare. But they had never faced an enemy that responded to such tactics by uniting multiple civilizations against them. Admiral stood on the bridge of the Nemesis, watching as the final alien research facility was secured by joint human-alien forces. The children who had been rescued from captivity were healing, though the psychological scars would take time to fade. But they would heal knowing that their suffering had led to the elimination of a threat that had terrorized multiple civilizations for centuries. Doctor, final assessment, he requested. Elizabeth looked at the data streaming from throughout alien space. Admiral, they retain the capacity for planetary civilization, but have been permanently relegated to a single-world species. More importantly, every spacefaring civilization within 50 light-years now understands that humanity considers threats to children grounds for termination, and the likelihood of future threats using similar tactics. Elizabeth smiled for the first time in months. Admiral, I believe we've established a galactic precedent that will make such tactics unthinkable for any rational civilization. Admiral nodded with satisfaction. The aliens had wanted to teach humanity about the costs of expansion into contested space. Instead, they had taught the galaxy that threatening children was the fastest way to face the united wrath of every civilization that valued the safety of their offspring. The war was nearly over, but the precedent they had established would protect children throughout the galaxy for generations to come. 1 year after the conclusion of what galactic historians would later call the Children's War, Dr. Elizabeth stood before the newly constructed Memorial Garden on New Eden. The planet had been rebuilt with contributions from 7 different species, each one representing a civilization that had been terrorized by the alien psychological warfare tactics generations ago. The memorial itself was a testament to transformation. Where the elementary school had once stood, a crystalline structure now rose toward the sky, its faceted surfaces reflecting the names of every child who had died in the initial attacks. But surrounding it were gardens tended by children from multiple species. Humans, yes, but also the offspring of civilizations that had thought they would never again be safe to explore the stars. Now 9 years old and showing remarkable resilience after months of therapy, carefully tended a section dedicated to earth flowers. Beside him, a young child whose species had been terrorized into isolation 3 centuries ago worked on a plot of crystalline formations that grew like living jewels. The sight would have been impossible a year ago, different species cooperating not out of necessity, but out of shared understanding of what they had almost lost. "Doctor, the Galactic Council representatives have arrived," announced Captain Sarah, formerly Admiral, who had requested reassignment to oversee the rebuilding efforts rather than continue with military command. The psychological toll of the war had affected everyone differently, and some found healing in creation rather than destruction. Elizabeth made her way to the council chambers that had been constructed adjacent to the memorial. The building's architecture incorporated design elements from multiple species, but the central theme was unmistakably human, wide spaces that encouraged communication, transparent walls that emphasized openness, and everywhere, subtle reminders of the children whose protection had united the galaxy. The Galactic Council session was unlike anything in recorded history. 17 different species had sent representatives, not to negotiate territorial boundaries or trade agreements, but to formalize what they were calling the Children's Accords, a treaty that would fundamentally change how civilizations interacted throughout the galaxy. Ambassador, formerly the chief medical officer at New Eden, had been appointed as humanity's chief representative. Her experience treating the survivors of alien psychological warfare had given her insights into psychology that proved invaluable in diplomatic contexts. "Representatives of the Galactic Council," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the translator systems. "We gather today not as separate civilizations competing for territory, but as sentient species united in the protection of our most vulnerable members, our children." The response from the assembled delegates was immediately positive. Ambassador Al of the Republic, whose species had abandoned space exploration for 3 centuries after facing alien psychological warfare, spoke with obvious emotion through his translator. "The species of Earth has demonstrated that threats to offspring need not be endured in isolation. Our children have known only the confines of our for 20 generations. Today, they tend gardens among the children of the species that freed us from that fear." Doctor observed the psychological dynamics at play with professional fascination. The trauma of the alien attacks had created bonds between species that transcended traditional diplomatic relationships. Shared experience of protecting children had become a foundation for galactic cooperation that political theorists would study for centuries. Fleet Admiral Wei, attending virtually from Earth where he was overseeing the transformation of human military doctrine, addressed the assembly with characteristic directness. "The Children's Accords represent more than a mutual defense treaty. They establish a fundamental principle. Any civilization that threatens the offspring of another species faces the combined response of every signatory civilization." The implications were staggering. Traditional galactic politics had been based on balance of power, territorial boundaries, and resource competition. The Children's Accords introduced a new paradigm, shared responsibility for protecting what every species valued most. "But we must also address the practical implications," added Ambassador of the Collective, whose species had provided crucial intelligence during the final phases of the war. "How do we define threats to children? How do we respond to situations where cultural practices of one species might be considered harmful by another?" Elizabeth stepped forward to address the question. Her year of studying psychology had prepared her for exactly these challenges. "The Accords establish investigation protocols that require evidence of systematic targeting of children for psychological or physical warfare purposes. We're not seeking to impose human cultural values on other species. We're seeking to prevent the of children in conflicts." The distinction was crucial. The aliens hadn't simply had cultural practices that differed from human values. They had systematically studied how to torture children from multiple species to achieve military objectives. The Children's Accords were designed to prevent that specific type of warfare while respecting legitimate cultural differences. Ambassador activated a holographic display showing the current status of former alien space. The rehabilitation efforts have exceeded all projections. The aliens themselves are adapting to planetary civilization more successfully than anticipated, particularly after we eliminated the hierarchical structures that enabled their psychological warfare policies. The transformation of the alien species had been one of the most challenging aspects of the post-war period. Rather than attempting genocide or forced relocation, humanity had chosen to dismantle their technological capacity while providing support for developing sustainable planetary civilization. The results had been remarkable. Removed from the rigid hierarchical structure that had enabled their psychological warfare doctrine, individual aliens demonstrated capacity for empathy and cooperation that had been suppressed for centuries. Former fleet commander, now serving as a liaison between his people and the galactic community, transmitted his own statement to the assembly. My species spent believing that psychological warfare against children was efficient military policy. We failed to understand that such tactics inevitably led to escalation that threatened our own survival. The humans demonstrated that protecting children creates strength, while threatening children creates unified enemies. Doctor found his words particularly significant from a psychological perspective. The aliens hadn't been inherently evil. They had developed a military doctrine that systematically eliminated empathy as a tactical disadvantage. But when that doctrine was forcibly dismantled, their capacity for emotional connection had returned remarkably quickly. Captain approached the discussion from a practical military perspective. The Accords established joint response forces, but more importantly, they establish communication protocols that allow for immediate coordination when any species' children are threatened. We've learned that the best defense against psychological warfare is ensuring that no species faces such threats alone. The military implications were significant. Traditional defense planning focused on protecting territory and resources. The Children's Accords created the galaxy's first military alliance specifically dedicated to protecting individuals, specifically the most vulnerable members of each species. We should also acknowledge the technological developments that have emerged from this cooperation, added Dr. James Wright, transmitting from the Jupiter research stations where human and alien scientists were now collaborating on projects that would have been unimaginable a year ago. Joint research into defensive technologies has advanced our collective capabilities by decades in just 12 months. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the species that had terrorized the galaxy through technological superiority was now contributing to defensive technologies that would protect other species' children. Their advanced medical knowledge, freed from military applications, had proven invaluable for treating trauma and developing psychological therapies. Elizabeth reviewed her analysis of the long-term psychological implications. Representatives were witnessing the emergence of a new model for galactic civilization. Instead of expansion through conquest or intimidation, we're seeing expansion through protective cooperation. Species are more willing to explore space knowing that threats to their children will be met with collective response. The Children's Accords were officially as the session concluded, but Elizabeth understood that the real treaty had been written in the gardens of New Eden, where children from multiple species played together without fear. The formal document simply what had already become a galactic reality. Threatening children was no longer a viable military strategy. As the representatives departed, Elizabeth made her way back to the memorial garden, and his alien friends were still tending their plots, chattering in a mixture of languages that their universal translators rendered into a symphony of childhood enthusiasm. Their easy cooperation represented something profound, the first generation to grow up in a galaxy where their protection was guaranteed by multiple civilizations. Admiral's final transmission of the day carried a note of satisfaction that Elizabeth had rarely heard in his voice. Doctor, Earth Command reports that colonial expansion applications have increased by 400% since the Accords were. For the first time in human history, parents feel safe sending their children to the frontier worlds. The psychological transformation was complete. What had begun as humanity's darkest moment, the systematic murder of children by alien forces, had evolved into the foundation for unprecedented galactic cooperation. The species that had sought to contain human expansion through terror had instead catalyzed humanity's emergence as a galactic protector. "Admiral, there's one more development worth noting," Elizabeth added. "Intelligence reports indicate that 3 other spacefaring civilizations in distant galactic regions are requesting information about the Children's Accords. Apparently, word of our response to threats against children has spread far beyond the local galactic community." Admiral's response carried a note of grim satisfaction. "Good. The more widely known our response becomes, the less likely any civilization will be to consider children acceptable targets." Elizabeth looked up at the memorial's crystalline structure, where the names of murdered children were now surrounded by images of gardens tended by young hands from across the galaxy. The aliens had wanted to teach humanity about the costs of expansion into contested space. Instead, they had taught the galaxy that protecting children was not just a moral imperative. It was the foundation of true civilization. Approached her as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden. "Doctor, why did the bad aliens hurt children?" Elizabeth knelt down to meet his eyes, considering how to explain something that even adult psychologists struggled to understand. "Sometimes, when people are afraid of losing something, they try to scare others by hurting what they love most. But they didn't understand that when you hurt someone's children, you don't make them afraid. You make them determined to protect every child in the galaxy." The boy considered this seriously, then nodded and returned to his garden plot. Around him, children from species that had been enemies, strangers, or victims just a year ago continued their work together, planting flowers and tending crystalline formations that would grow for generations. Elizabeth realized she was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization that spanned species boundaries, united not by conquest or commerce, but by shared commitment to protecting what every sentient species valued most. The aliens had sought to fragment the galaxy through fear and intimidation. Instead, they had united it through love and protection. The children's war was over. The children's peace had begun. As the sun set over New Eden, casting rainbow patterns through the memorial's crystalline surfaces, Elizabeth composed her final report on the psychological implications of humanity's transformation from colonial expansion force to galactic protector. The species that had murdered children to enforce territorial boundaries had inadvertently created something they could never have imagined. A galaxy where every child, regardless of species, was protected by the combined might of 17 civilizations. They had slaughtered humanity's children to teach a lesson about the costs of expansion. They had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, but the lesson learned was not the one they intended to teach. They had taught the galaxy that threatening children was not a path to tactical advantage, but a guarantee of extinction. And that lesson would echo across the stars for as long as sentient species remembered the price of making war on innocence.